Oh, now live.
Hey guys, we made it. We made it. Okay, so the first thing that I do when trying to decide where I'm going to put the rows is one, ask the client where they would normally part their hair. So usually part down the middle, correct? Mm-hmm. Yep. And if someone kind of does both, they flip-flop and they part it in the middle, both sides. I usually recommend parting it in the middle so that they're able to flip-flop it. But if they do favor a certain side, just keep in mind, you know, that you have to use your 3-finger rule to make sure that if they do part it, you know, on this certain side, that you make sure that your end bead is no higher than your 3-finger. So today we're doing 1 row, but I did want to show you guys 1 row placement, a 2-row placement, and a 3-row placement. I'm just going to show you the sectioning. So I always do it on wet hair. It's just easier for me personally to part on wet hair. So I'm going to show you a 1 row. So 1 row, what I usually do is I take my 3 fingers, I go from her hairline back 3 fingers, and from her part down 3 fingers, and kind of where they meet is where I start my section. And I keep in mind that, okay, she is only getting 1 row, so I need the most coverage and she wants the most length. But if she does have any short layers, I need to make sure that the row is up high enough that it's gonna help blend with these layers, because if it's too far down, you're gonna have to cut too much off that length to blend it in. So I try to make sure that that parting is pretty much in the center of their head. And everybody's head's shaped a little bit differently. Everybody has a different haircut, so you may have to put it lower or higher depending on, you know, where their shortest layers are. And I do always like to put a little bit of a teardrop or a U shape, a halo, whatever you want to call it. Okay, and then I come back onto this side too and do double check and make sure 3 fingers back. Okay, that's a little bit more than 3 fingers, so I'm gonna take a little bit more. This would be, on this particular client, a 1 row sectioning. I always like to look in the mirror as well and make sure that either side is, you know, pretty symmetrical. And obviously you want everything to be super clean, okay? So this would be where her row would go. This is probably going to be where her row is going to go. You could probably dip a smidgen bit lower, but again, you want to keep in mind those shorter layers. If it's too far down, you're not going to be able to blend those layers. So now for a 2 row. For a 2 row, you still want to keep in mind the 3-finger rule. So you want it to be 3 fingers from the ear this time, because this is going to be the bottom row. So same on this side, 3 fingers from the ear. And then a lot of people like to use the occipital bone as a reference point. A lot of this comes with preference too. Some people, me personally, and a few other hairdressers I know, we like to go actually below the occipital just because it helps blend any really short pieces that you have under here. But for a lot of people, it can be uncomfortable. So that's something that you kind of have to work out with your client as well. See if they're comfortable with it. Sometimes people are not comfortable with it and some people prefer it. So you also want to make sure that right in through here, around the ear, this is where that 3-finger rule is super important. You can also use your foiling comb as a reference. So say, we're gonna come down here a little bit. So basically, you know, wherever you would have put 1 row, you're gonna put a row on either side of where you would have put a single row, if you kind of think of it like that. So this is where her bottom row would go. And I always turn my chair. That's what they're for. So here again, I'm gonna measure with my finger, 3 fingers above the ear, and this is most important when you're doing 2 rows. If you're doing 1 row, you probably shouldn't be that close down to the ear. And also this bottom row is not going to be as high up as if it was a single row. Okay. As far as where her end bead is going to go. So again, I like to go in and make sure each side is going to be even. Some people do not have symmetrical heads either, so you just have to eyeball it and make sure it's going to look the most natural. I look at it from all angles. I look at it from the back to make sure it's even. I look at it from the sides, from the top, from the front in the mirror to make sure everything looks really good. Okay, so this would have been her first row, her bottom row if we were doing a 2-row install. It's 3 fingers from the ear. You would do 3 fingers from the hairline, just making sure, you know, if they have any very fine hair here, you would just go back into where her hair gets a little more sturdy. You would never want to put a bead on very fine hair like this. It will just, not good. Okay, so that would be her first row. So we're gonna drop everything down, pretend like we just installed the row. We go back to her parting. So obviously her bottom row doesn't get affected much by where she parts her hair. The top row is gonna be where you might see an end bead or you might see a weft if it's too far up on the head. Also, this is a big spot for like cowlick, so you have to make sure you fluff your client's hair a little bit and see, you know, where their cowlick is, because if you put a weft right in between their cowlick, it's gonna cause problems. So 3 fingers down, same idea as when you were doing that single row, but now this is gonna be a little bit higher up. And if somebody has shorter layers, you always want to go a little bit higher with your row. It'll just give them a little more coverage and it'll be so much easier to blend. And keep in mind too, like not every section has to be super slanted or, you know, super, you know, U-shaped. It all depends on the client's head. You also don't want it to be, you know, always straight across, like from ear to ear. A person's head is round, so you want to kind of go with the shape of somebody's head. And so again, if someone is parting on the side, your like your teardrop or your section is not going to be perfectly symmetrical. It's going to be, you know, scooched over to the side a little bit because that's where they part their hair. Okay, so that's probably where I would put her second row. You know, just making sure too that when I put her hair down, you know, part it in the middle and I put my foiling comb on where the section is, that you cannot see the foiling comb. And so now for 3 rows, it gets a little bit tricky. You gotta make sure you space your rows evenly apart in the right spots so that you have enough room on the head to put all the rows. So your bottom row is pretty much gonna be the same because you can only go so far down. But your second row isn't gonna come all the way up here if you're doing 3 rows. It's gonna go in between where you would have, you know, here, that's gonna be your first row. You would dip down a little bit more for your second row. And some people have little heads, so putting 3 rows in sometimes can be a challenge, and you're like, where do we put it? So sometimes maybe your bottom row would only be like a mini, and it maybe might only go from like ear to ear in the back here, but you still want to have like a little bit of a swoop. You don't ever really want to go straight across like this, just because you don't get as much coverage. Like if you just go from here to here at the nape of somebody's neck, you might as well go from, you know, the back of her ear to here, because then you're just going to get more coverage in this area right here, which usually is very sparse on a person. So, first row, second row is going to be, you know, in between. And once you get that first row in, you can gauge a little bit better where that second row is going to go. So see how much different, this looks so much different than when I just had the 2, because I'm spacing them a little bit closer together now, because I have to fit all 3 rows. And on your second row, your beads are probably not going to come as far forward as your top row. Your beads are only going to come probably to about here. And, you know, it always depends on, so let me just give you depends on the person's shape, hairline shape. So this is a great way to gauge where your first bead is going to go. You want to make sure that you cannot see this through the hair. Great way to gauge. Okay, so that would be pretty much second row placement, and then your third row placement is going to come up pretty high. Full coverage. You can come up on top if you want. Okay, so again, 3 rows from the hairline. 3 rows from the hair, 3 fingers, I mean, from the hairline. But again, you want to make sure when you stick that comb under, you have to make sure you can't see. And sometimes this one is not so teardrop. Sometimes this one is a little more hot dog. Hot dog. Rectangular, hot dog, I don't know what you want to call it, U-shaped. Not so much of a teardrop. So this would be very similar to what a third row placement would be. But so even this is starting to dry, and it's getting harder for me to like section it. So I'll always just go in and spritz it down, because it just helps make a very clean section. And this is preference too. Some people like their rows really high up, really, really close to their hairline. Some people crash into it a lot because it's a very high trafficked area and it's not a good placement for them. So that's something that you need to kind of work out with your client and ask them, see if it's comfortable. And sometimes that's trial and error. Sometimes they don't know that they don't like it there, so you need to get them back in and tweak it for them, and that's what you need to do. So that would be like your third row placement, or a lot of people will put like a little mini here, but I always say if you're gonna go for it, just go for it and do another third row, but that's a lot of hair. So you can see you would have enough room for 1 row, 2 row, 3 row. A 1 row would go about here, 2 row would go about here and here. There it is, guys. Row placement. Hi.
That's great. I learned a